The ground shakes first. Not the small tremors people here have learned to live with, the ones that rattle a clay jar off a shelf and are forgotten by evening, but something deeper, something that seems to come from underneath the sea itself. Out on the horizon, past the northern coast of Crete, the island of Thera is tearing itself apart, and within hours, the sky over the Aegean will turn the colour of a bruise. But that catastrophe is still decades away from the moment we actually want to start with. Because before we can understand how the greatest civilization of the Bronze Age fell, we have to understand what it looked like standing. Picture a valley a few kilometers inland from the northern shore of Crete, green with olive trees and wild thyme, and at its centre, a sprawling complex of buildings rising 4 and in places even 5 stories high, their walls painted in red ochre and Egyptian blue, their rooftops catching the morning sun like something built by people who were not afraid of anything. This is Knossos, and before we go any further, it's worth saying the name properly, because most people get it wrong without realising it. It isn't Knossos with a silent first letter. The K is pronounced, and the stress lands on the last syllable, Knossos. A small correction, but the kind of detail that the people who actually study this place, and plenty of viewers who grew up on Crete, will notice immediately. Around 1700 BC, at the height of what we now call Minoan civilization, and if you had walked into its central courtyard that morning, you would have smelled roasting barley, crushed olives, and the sharp tang of murex dye being boiled somewhere behind the workshops. You would have heard the clatter of loom weights, the low murmur of 100 different transactions, in a language that, frustratingly, we still cannot fully read. That's the strange thing about this place. We have their palace, we have their frescoes, their jewellery, their storage jars taller than a grown man, their bathtubs with actual drainage systems that predate anything comparable in Europe by well over 1,000 years. What we don't fully have is their voice. The script they used for their own language, the one scholars call Linear A, remains undeciphered to this day. We can read the shapes of the letters, we simply don't know with certainty what most of them mean.
So everything I'm about to tell you comes from a strange kind of detective work, piecing together broken pottery, painted walls, burned grain, and the bones of the people who lived and died here, to reconstruct a civilization that speaks to us in images long before it will ever speak to us in words. Let's start with a girl. We'll call her Aikara, because we don't know her real name, only that a name close to that shape appears on administrative tablets from this period, attached to rations of oil and wool. She would have been perhaps 14, working in the textile district on the western side of the palace complex, where hundreds of workers, most of them women, spun and dyed and wove wool that would eventually be shipped out across the Aegean, to Egypt, to the Levant, to the mainland of Greece itself. Her hands would have been stained purple some days from the dye vats, calloused from the loom, and if she was skilled enough, if her weave was tight and even, she might have been chosen to work on the finer cloth, the kind that ended up wrapped around the wrists of a priestess during a festival, or traded to a merchant from Ugarit for a chunk of raw copper. Because that's really what built Knossos in the first place. Not conquest, not armies marching over the hills, but trade. Crete sits almost perfectly in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean, close enough to Egypt to catch its trade winds, close enough to Anatolia and the Levant to trade metal and timber, close enough to the Greek mainland to export pottery and oil by the shipload. The Minoans built their wealth on ships, not swords, and for a long time that led to a very popular idea about them, that here, uniquely among Bronze Age societies, was a civilization without war. No walls around their cities, no obvious fortifications around the palace itself. Some of the earliest excavators looked at the peaceful frescoes of dolphins and flowers and concluded they'd found a lost paradise, a society that had simply never learned to fight. It's a beautiful idea. It's also not quite true, and it matters that we say so honestly, because getting swept up in a nice story is exactly how history gets distorted. Bronze swords have been found across Crete. Some of them ceremonial, yes, but others clearly built for use, with wear patterns that suggest real combat rather than display. Seal stones from the period depict armed men in scenes that look nothing like ritual. There's even evidence of watchtowers along parts of the coast.
The Minoans weren't a warrior culture in the way the Mycenaeans on the mainland would later become, obsessed with weapons and burial hoards of bronze. But they were not defenseless either, and a civilization that controlled trade routes worth this much wealth almost certainly needed to protect them. The absence of massive city walls probably tells us less about pacifism and more about confidence in a navy that could intercept trouble before it ever reached the shore. Now, here's where things get genuinely contested among the people who study this civilization. And I want to walk through it carefully, because the comment section under every single video about Crete turns into a battlefield the moment this question comes up. Were the Minoans Greek? The honest answer is that we don't fully know, and anyone who tells you with total certainty in either direction is skipping past a lot of complicated evidence. What we do know is this.
The language written in Linear A, the Minoans' own script, remains undeciphered, and what little we can reconstruct of its sound patterns doesn't cleanly match early Greek. Later, after the fall of Knossos, a different script appears at the site, Linear B, and that one has been deciphered. It is Greek, an early form of it, used by the Mycenaeans, who eventually took control of the palace. So the people writing in Greek at Knossos arrived by the archaeological record sometime after the Minoan peak, not before it. At the same time, recent genetic studies on skeletal remains from Minoan burial sites, including a cemetery in Labyrinth, have found that the population was closely related to other Bronze Age and Neolithic populations of the wider Aegean and southeastern Europe, without evidence of significant North African ancestry, a finding that itself has settled one persistent myth while leaving the bigger question of Minoan identity still open. Some scholars argue for deep cultural continuity between Minoan and later Greek civilization. Others argue the Minoans were a distinct Aegean people who were eventually absorbed, culturally and linguistically, by Greek-speaking newcomers. Both positions have serious researchers behind them, and until Linear A is one day cracked open, if it ever is, nobody gets to declare final victory. What's not in dispute is that this civilization, whatever we call its ethnicity, left fingerprints all over what would become Greek culture. Words survive that pass almost unchanged from that world into the Greek spoken today. Things like the word for market or place names that carry the shape of a language spoken 3,500 years ago. Whether or not you call the builders of Knossos Greek, you cannot deny that Greece, as it exists now, still carries pieces of them.
Before we go further, it's worth pausing on just how many people we're actually talking about, because it's easy to picture a single grand palace and forget that Knossos was the center of an entire civilization. At its peak, the towns surrounding the palace may have housed somewhere close to 25 to 30,000 people, a genuinely enormous population for the Bronze Age, and estimates for Minoan Crete as a whole run into the low hundreds of thousands, spread across dozens of towns, harbours and smaller palace centres like Phaistos and Mallia. That's not a village playing dress-up as an empire. That's a functioning state with granaries to feed it, roads to connect it, and an administrative system precise enough to track individual jars of oil by name and quantity on clay tablets that have survived, by pure accident of fire, for 36 centuries. Let's go back to the palace itself, because the scale of the place deserves more attention than it usually gets. This wasn't a single building, it was a vast, sprawling complex covering more than 20,000 square meters, arranged around a central courtyard, with storage magazines lined with pithoi, enormous ceramic jars taller than a person, some capable of holding hundreds of liters of olive oil or wine. Beneath the floors ran a genuine plumbing system, terracotta pipes designed with tapered sections that increased water pressure and reduced buildup, carrying both fresh water in and wastewater out. There were flushing toilets. There was a bathroom, likely used by the ruling household, equipped with a tub that had to be filled and drained by hand, but was nonetheless a level of domestic comfort that most of the ancient world, and frankly a huge part of the medieval world thousands of years later, simply did not have. Whoever built this palace understood engineering in a way that feels startlingly modern when you actually stop to think about the date. This is 37 centuries ago. There were people bathing in something resembling running water, while much of the rest of the known world was still hauling every drop by hand. And the building itself kept growing upward, not just outward. Some sections rose 4 stories, and a sealstone discovered at ancient Kydonia, modern-day Chania, appears to depict buildings with as many as 5 levels near a harbour, suggesting that whatever we see surviving at Knossos today, damaged, partially reconstructed, missing its upper floors entirely in most areas, is only a shadow of how tall this civilization was actually building. Imagine walking through a valley in the Bronze Age and looking up at a structure 5 stories tall, its walls blazing with colour, and trying to explain to yourself what kind of people could build something like that. Food ran this place as much as art did. Beneath the ceremonial rooms and painted corridors, the palace held storage magazines, lined with those enormous pithoi jars, some large enough that a grown man could climb inside one, holding olive oil, wine, grain and dried legumes, on a scale that suggests Knossos wasn't just feeding its own residents, it was likely redistributing surplus across the wider region, acting as a kind of central bank of food security in years when harvests failed elsewhere on the island. Archaeologists have found carbonized remains of figs, grapes, olives, wheat and barley throughout the site, along with fish bones and evidence of hunted game, a diet that would look remarkably familiar to anyone who has eaten a Mediterranean meal in the last few decades. There's something almost comforting in that continuity. The idea that a family sitting down to bread, olives and wine on Crete today is, without necessarily realizing it, eating something close to what a palace scribe might have eaten on his lunch break 37 centuries ago. Now picture a man we'll call Dexo, an artisan working somewhere on the upper floor of the West Wing around 1650 BC, mixing pigment for a fresco. His job wasn't ceremonial, it was physically demanding, technical work, applying pigment to wet plaster so the colour would bond permanently into the wall as it dried, a technique that required speed and precision because once the plaster set, there was no correcting a mistake. He'd have worked with reds ground from ochre, blues imported at enormous expense from Egyptian sources, blacks from charcoal, and he'd have painted the world the way his patrons wanted to see it. Dolphins leaping around ships, young men and women vaulting over the backs of charging bulls, processions of figures carrying offerings toward a shrine. The frescoes that survive from Knossos are some of the most vivid windows we have into any Bronze Age society anywhere on Earth. And one detail about them tends to surprise modern audiences more than almost anything else. Minoan women in the original frescoes are frequently depicted with their upper bodies bare, following a fashion that appears repeatedly across the art of this culture, And in more sanitized modern reconstructions, this detail often quietly disappears, smoothed over for a wider audience. It's a small thing, but it says something important, that even 3,500 years later, we're still editing the past to make it comfortable for the present. And that's worth resisting whenever we can, because the goal here isn't a comfortable version of Knossos, it's the real one. The bull is everywhere in that art, and it deserves its own moment, because it's the single image most people associate with this place, even if they've never heard the word Minoan in their life. You've probably heard the myth. King Minos, a labyrinth built by the genius craftsman Daedalus, a monstrous creature called the Minotaur hidden at its centre, half man and half bull, fed on the flesh of Athenian youths sent as tribute every 9 years, until the hero Theseus finally enters the maze, kills the beast, and finds his way back out using a thread given to him by the king's daughter. It's one of the most famous stories to come out of the ancient Mediterranean, and for centuries it was treated as pure invention. Then archaeologists actually dug into this hillside and found a palace so architecturally complex, with so many interconnected rooms, corridors, and storage magazines on multiple levels, that early visitors genuinely got lost inside it. They found room after room decorated with bull imagery. They found evidence, in fresco and in figurine, of a ritual sport called bull leaping, where young athletes, both men and women, would grab the horns of a charging bull and vault directly over its back.
Whether that ritual was purely ceremonial, deadly serious, or something performed with trained and cooperative animals is still debated. But either way, you start to see how a real building this labyrinthine, built by a real and highly skilled civilization obsessed with the image of the bull, could have calcified over centuries of retelling into a myth about a monster in a maze. The legend probably isn't literal history, but it almost certainly isn't pure fantasy either. It's memory, distorted by 1,000 years of storytelling wrapped around a real place that genuinely did feel, to anyone stepping inside it for the first time, like it might swallow you whole. Religion at Knossos didn't live in a single temple, the way it did in Egypt or Mesopotamia. It seems to have been woven directly into the palace itself, into small shrine rooms tucked between storage magazines, into open-air peak sanctuaries built on nearby mountaintops, and into the great courtyard where processions and festivals would have gathered the whole community at once. Imagine a woman we'll call Passia, likely trained from childhood in a family line of ritual specialists, standing at the head of one of these processions during the grape harvest, wearing a flounced skirt dyed the deep purple that only the wealthiest households could afford, holding a double axe carved from bronze that was never meant to chop wood, only to be raised, catch the light, and remind everyone watching exactly whose authority governed the harvest, the storerooms, and the fate of the coming year. Whether she held political power in the way we'd recognize it today, or purely religious authority that happened to command enormous social respect, is exactly the kind of distinction that gets lost when a single fresco travels around the internet stripped of all its context. Which brings us to the question of who actually ran this place, because this is where the comment section debates get loudest, and where I want to be especially careful, because it's easy to overcorrect a story in either direction. The frescoes at Knossos give women extraordinary visual prominence. Priestesses appear in positions of ritual authority. Processions are led by richly dressed women. Some of the most iconic art from this civilization, the so-called snake goddess figurines, depict women holding serpents, associated with either divine or priestly power.
Based on this, a popular narrative has grown up online that Minoan Crete was ruled entirely by women, a genuine ancient matriarchy in contrast to the warrior kings dominating the rest of the Bronze Age world. It's a compelling story, and there's real evidence behind the idea that women held significant religious and possibly economic authority here, likely more than in most other Bronze Age societies we know of. But the honest picture is more complicated than a simple flip from patriarchy to matriarchy. Administrative tablets reference a ruler, often interpreted as male, and later Greek tradition, however unreliable, consistently remembers a king Minos rather than a queen. The most defensible conclusion isn't that women ruled Knossos outright, but that Minoan society appears to have given women a level of public, religious, and possibly political visibility that stands out sharply against its neighbours. And that alone was enough of a departure from the norm to leave a lasting impression on everyone who encountered it, then and now. Let's talk about trade again for a moment, because it's easy to focus entirely on frescoes and palaces, and forget that this civilization's real superpower was logistics. Minoan pottery has been found in Egypt, in the Levant, on Cyprus, across the Cyclades, and on the Greek mainland. Egyptian tomb paintings from this period depict figures identified as Keftiu, widely believed to be Minoans, bringing tribute or trade goods, elaborate vessels that match styles found at Knossos almost exactly. This wasn't an isolated island kingdom. This was a hub, arguably the central hub, of Mediterranean exchange for several centuries, moving copper from Cyprus, tin from as far as Anatolia or beyond, ivory from Egypt, and turning imported raw material into finished luxury goods that then went right back out across the sea. A merchant we might call Tema, based on names attested in tablets from this era, could have spent a season sailing a route from Knossos to the Nile Delta and back, trading painted pottery and olive oil for Egyptian linen and gold, and returning home wealthier and probably fluent in at least a working version of 2 or 3 languages, because that's simply what the job demanded. But none of that wealth was shared evenly, and it's worth being honest about that too, instead of only telling the pretty version of this story. The tablets that survive from the palace archives aren't poetry. They're accounting records, meticulous lists of who owed what to whom, how many jars of oil were promised, how much wool was still outstanding from which workshop. That kind of bureaucracy doesn't exist without a ruling class extracting surplus from ordinary labourers, the weavers, the farmers, the fishermen, the people whose names never made it onto a single surviving tablet. Tema the merchant, sailing home with a hold full of Egyptian linen, was the exception, not the rule. For every trader who came home wealthier, there were dozens of families in the surrounding hillside villages who spent their whole lives producing the oil, the wool, and the grain that funded the palace's frescoes and its 5-story walls, without ever once seeing the inside of that painted courtyard themselves. It's a pattern that shows up in almost every wealthy civilization we've ever looked at on this channel. The widening gap between the people who build the wealth and the people who get to enjoy it. And Knossos, for all its beauty, was no exception to that rule. All of that wealth, all of that scale, ended in what appears to have been a slow and then very sudden collapse. And this is where we come back to Thera, the volcanic island now known as Santorini, sitting roughly 100 kilometers north of Crete. Sometime around 1600 BC, give or take a few decades depending on which dating method you trust, Thera erupted in one of the largest volcanic events of the ancient world. An explosion so massive it blew the center of the island apart and buried the nearby settlement of Akrotiri under meters of ash, preserving it almost the way Pompeii would be preserved more than 2,000 years later. The eruption itself likely didn't destroy Knossos directly. The island's own excavations show the palace continued to function for some time afterward. But the secondary effects would have been devastating regardless. Tsunamis tearing through Crete's northern harbours, the very harbours this entire trade economy depended on. Ashfall damaging crops, years of disrupted climate and failed trade routes, chipping away at a system that had taken centuries to build. Civilizations rarely collapse from a single blow. They usually crumble because the blow lands on top of stresses that were already building. And in the decades following the eruption, we see exactly that kind of slow unraveling across Minoan sites. Weakened trade, weakened harvests, and eventually weakened defences against outsiders. Somewhere along that northern coast, on the morning the wave came in, a fisherman we might call Knossos would have been hauling nets at first light, the way his father and grandfather had done, when the sea did something no one in living memory had seen it do before. It pulled back, exposing wet sand and stranded fish far beyond the normal tide line, and for one long, confused moment, people would have walked out onto that newly exposed seabed, curious, maybe even laughing, before the water came back in a wall taller than the harbour buildings. We can't know if Knossos survived that morning. Statistically, in the settlements closest to the water, most people didn't. What we do know is that harbours up and down Crete's northern coast show archaeological evidence of exactly this kind of sudden, violent disruption in the archaeological layers dating to this period. Ash deposits mixed with debris consistent with tsunami damage. The physical fingerprint of a single, terrible morning that a whole trading economy never fully recovered from. Those outsiders were the Mycenaeans, the mainland Greek civilization whose warrior aristocracy had been growing in wealth and ambition for generations. The same people who would, a few centuries later, sail 1,000 ships against the walls of a city on the Anatolian coast. A city we've already told the story of on this channel, Troy. By around 1450 BC, most Minoan palaces across Crete had been destroyed, many by fire, except for Knossos itself, which continued on for another generation or two, but now under new management. The script changes at this point from the still mysterious Linear A to Linear B, which we can read, and which turns out to be an early form of Greek, used by administrators now running the palace's economy in the language of the mainland conquerors. Whether this was a hostile takeover in the wake of a weakened, disaster-struck civilization, a gradual cultural absorption, or some mixture of both, is still argued over by historians, but the outcome is clear either way. The people who had built Europe's first great palace civilization were, within a few generations, ruled by someone else's language, and Knossos itself would finally burn for the last time around 1350 BC, after which it was never again the seat of a great power. And then, for more than 3,000 years, it simply disappeared. Not physically, the mound remained, known locally by the name Kefala, but its meaning was gone. Farmers grew crops over the ruins. Generations passed with no memory of what lay underneath, until a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans arrived at the very start of the 20th century, bought the land, and began to dig. What he found stunned the archaeological world, a civilization older than classical Greece, older than anything anyone had expected to find on the island, complete with plumbing, multi-story architecture, and frescoes unlike anything previously known from the Bronze Age Aegean. Evans named this civilization Minoan, after the legendary king Minos, and in doing so, he became, almost single-handedly, the person who invented our modern image of this culture. But Evans didn't just excavate Knossos, he rebuilt parts of it, using concrete and paint to reconstruct columns, staircases, and entire rooms, based on his own interpretation of the fragmentary evidence. Some of what tourists walk through at Knossos today isn't 3,500 years old at all. It's early 20th century concrete, painted in colours Evans and his restoration team chose based on educated guesswork, sometimes influenced, critics argue, more by the artistic tastes of Evans's own era than by rigorous evidence. Later generations of archaeologists have been sharply critical of this approach, and it's a fair criticism. When you reconstruct a lost civilization, you're not just recovering the past, you're also, whether you intend to or not, imposing your own present onto it. It doesn't make Evans's discovery any less extraordinary. It just means that every time you look at a photograph of the famous red columns at Knossos, you're looking at one man's best guess about the past, frozen in concrete, standing in for a truth we can no longer fully verify.
Evans funded much of this work himself, and he ran his excavation almost like a private kingdom, employing hundreds of local Cretan labourers, some of whom, according to accounts from the dig, developed a sharper eye for spotting artifacts in the soil than the trained archaeologists supervising them. It's a detail that rarely makes it into the popular story, that the physical labour of recovering this civilization, the digging, the sifting, the careful lifting of fragile pottery out of trenches under the Mediterranean sun was done overwhelmingly by ordinary Cretan families working for a wage, while the credit, the books, and the name attached to the discovery all went to Evans alone. That imbalance between the people who do the digging and the people who get remembered for the find isn't unique to Crete. It's a pattern that repeats itself across almost every major excavation of this era, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. There's something oddly fitting about that, actually, when you step back and think about everything this civilization has meant to the people who've encountered it since. An undeciphered script that people still argue over, a myth about a labyrinth and a monster that turned out to be rooted in something startlingly real. A palace, partly rebuilt from imagination, standing on top of ruins that are genuinely ancient. A population whose ethnic and linguistic identity is still debated with real passion, sometimes real anger, in comment sections and academic journals alike. Knossos has never quite stopped being reconstructed, first by nature, then by conquest, then by time, then by one determined Englishman with a shovel and a checkbook, and now by all of us, still arguing over what it actually was. What we do know, with total certainty, is what it left behind. The word labyrinth itself, still used in dozens of languages to describe anything hopelessly complex, traces back to this exact palace, possibly from the Minoan word for the double-headed axe, labris, an object carved into walls throughout the site as a sacred symbol. Words for markets, for certain place names across the Aegean, appear to carry sound patterns straight out of Linear A into the Greek spoken on Crete today, even if we can't read the original meaning behind them. Later, the same scripts that recorded this civilization's economy would help unravel the mystery of the world after it. Because it's worth remembering that our other stop on Crete's Bronze Age neighbours doesn't end here either. When the Mycenaeans who took over Knossos eventually sailed east a few generations later to lay siege to a city on the coast of Anatolia, the war we told you about when we covered Troy on this channel, they carried with them the exact same warrior culture, the same taste for bronze, gold, and glory in death that had already replaced the quieter, trade-driven world of the Minoans back home. In a very real sense, the fall of Knossos and the war at Troy are chapters of the same story. One civilization's slow decline, making room for the rise of the one that would go on to fight the most famous war in ancient memory. And every single year, hundreds of thousands of people still walk into that valley, stand beneath those red columns, real and reconstructed alike, and feel exactly what a merchant, a weaver, an artisan mixing fresco pigment, or a young athlete about to vault over the horns of a bull would have felt looking up at those walls 37 centuries ago. The unmistakable sense that they were standing inside something built by people who believed, with total confidence, that what they were making would outlast them. They were right.
It's still here. We're still trying to read it. And somewhere in a script we haven't cracked yet, there might be a name, a date, a complaint about the harvest, an ordinary sentence written by an ordinary person who never once imagined that 3,500 years later, strangers on the other side of the world would still be trying so hard just to hear their voice.